Baba, welcome to this week's edition of Ghana in Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, journalist, historian, podcaster, and entrepreneur. And in this week's edition of Ghana in Focus is a special. We're doing a review of Ghana 2025, part one, looking at the economy, the cost of living crisis, unemployment, and the opposition MPP. So that's the theme for this week's show, Ghana in Focus Special, review of 2025, part one. Before we do that, just to remind you that if you like what you hear, please share to your friends, family, social media networks, subscribe to Ghana African Focus on YouTube, subscribe to Ghana African Focus on Spotify, and we want to get as much wins as you can. So please pass the word on to your friends and family about this fantastic podcast called Ghana in Focus. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe. So like I said on YouTube, look out for Ghana African Focus on YouTube. Hit that notification bell, meaning that every time we upload a new podcast, YouTube notifies you of it. Similarly, again with Spotify, look out for Ghana African Focus on Spotify. Hit the follow button, meaning that every time we download a new podcast, Spotify will remind you. On all that, like I said last week, we've had some great feedback from Spotify over the last 12 months. And we're going to tell you, just before we start the show, some facts and figures about my Spotify listeners. So I believe that the bulk of my listeners on Spotify. Okay? And so we're just going to give you some figures concerning Spotify. So firstly, the total audience increased this year by 43%. That's a massive growth. So thank you very much for you listeners on Spotify. Up 43% from my audience last year. Now, again, total new audience, so this is people that tuned in for the first time, increased by a whopping 919% from last year. Fantastic. My followers increased by 24% from last year. So that's an encouraging sign. So please, like I said, keep following me on Spotify and sign up to Ghana African Focus on Spotify. So again, the total followers increased by 24% on last year's figures. And my increase in total listen, so that's the total listening time from last year, increased by 17%. So now we bring some more stats. So there was one episode that got everyone talking this year, and that episode was, not surprisingly, why the white man wants to kill Ibn Chilwe. That was the most popular podcast that we uploaded this year on Spotify. Why African Focus Special? Why the white man wants to kill Ibn Chilwe. Okay, now this particular podcast was, it apparently was played 300% more than the other podcasts that I've done throughout the year. So that shows you about those kind of a podcast that you like, those kind of introspective, deep analysis that you like. So thank you to all of you who made that particular podcast, Why the White Man Wants to Kill Ibn Chilwe, a great success and went viral on Spotify. So moving on then. So across Spotify network, we were downloaded in more than 50 countries, yeah? And my top 5 countries were 5. The 5th place was Colombia. The 4th most listened to country was Germany. The 3rd most listened to country was Ghana. 2nd most listened to was United Kingdom. And the top country, which my podcast listeners were tuning to, was from the United States of America. So again, thank you to all these countries who downloaded a edition of Ghana African Focus. Thank you for that. And thank you especially to listeners in the United States, the UK, Ghana, Germany, and Colombia. All right, so moving on with some more figures from Spotify. So, in terms of top fans, apparently on Spotify, Ghana African Focus is a top 10 show for 114 of you, which is interesting. I'm a top 5 show for 79 of you, and I'm a top show, the #1 show for 24 fans, which is quite interesting. So finally, on this Spotify end of year review, so they're saying, according to Spotify, that 2025, Ghana African Focus was one of the talked about podcast. Apparently, I received more comments than 89% of other shows on Spotify, which is quite staggering. So that wraps up the Spotify stats for this year. Again, thank you very much to all of you who listen on Spotify, who downloaded on Spotify, who made comments, and who made the show such a great success on Spotify. We look forward to you continuing to listen to Ghana African Focus in 2026. All right, so let's get into a podcast looking at year in review in Ghana for this year, 2025, looking at the economy, the cost of living, unemployment, and the opposition New Patriotic Party. So, Ghana went to polls a year ago, and they voted overwhelmingly for the NDC, John Dramani Mahama, and John Dramani Mahama was sworn in again for a second term on January 7th, 2025. So bringing back the NDC back to power on the platform of resetting the economy for the Ghanaian that we want, with basically his 24-hour economy a central theme of that administration. And so, we're looking about the economy. So, the NDC and Mahama inherited a basically economy that was online support machine. We were all aware that during the latter stages of the NPP, last NPP government, inflation peaked at 54%, went down to about 25%. Interest rates were stubbornly high in the 30s%. And, it made, the cost of living, the economy was that bad that many people left Ghana, and also many businesses closed, their businesses in Ghana, moved out of Ghana, and also that compounded the economy in terms of, the debt, the domestic debt program that I'll talk about next week, and also, even people's pensions were, stolen, to be quite frank, stolen, and they were used to pay back, loans that the government had not been able to pay back. So the economy was in such a bad shape when the NDC came to power on January 7, 2025. So let's look at some stats in terms of the economy. So, like I mentioned, the NDC inherited interest rates at 25%. They've since gone down to 18%, which is much better than what it is. Although the banks in Ghana haven't really passed on these low interest rates or the Bank of Ghana's policy rate to the customers or to the consumers. And so compared to the rest of Africa, Ghana still has high interest rates, which makes the cost of borrowing for businesses quite expensive as compared to other African countries, particularly in the sub-region. Now, again, if you are someone who wants to do business in Ghana, you must bear that in mind that the cost of doing business in Ghana is very expensive compared to other African countries in the West Africa sub-region. Again, but it's on a downward trajectory. So that's positive. Again, we look at, inflation. Inflation began the year in the high 20s. As of last month, November, we haven't got December's out yet, but as of December, we've had December's policy figure rate for inflation. So as of December, inflation in Ghana now stands at 6%, down from a whopping 26% in January. So it shows you that the NDC agenda of economic reset has paid dividends, and also the 2025 budget and mid-year review have its theme reset, restructure, and rebuild after the disastrous 22-23 crisis, which resulted in a massive devaluation of the cedi, and also peaking those interest rates at 54%. So, even though the economy has seen some stabilization, growth has already surpassed the government's target. So, the mid-year data that we have shows that Ghana's economic growth for 2025 already surpassed the government's full-year target, indicating a sharper rebound than expected and outpacing some regional peers. Again, we talked about inflation, we talked about interest rates. So the policy rates and T-bill rates, which is Treasury bill rates, are high compared to West African countries, but are facing a downward trajectory, reflecting a cautious move away from crisis-level monetary tightening while trying not to reignite inflation. So the cedi, which was a big issue, particularly 22-23, has shown relative stability this year, and they started the year at 15 cedis to $1. As of this podcast talking to you right now, the cedi is now at 11.5 to $1. So this year, in actual fact, the cedi this year has gained 25%, of its value of the American dollar. So the economic management and fiscal discipline in which the NDC has operated this year has reaped benefit when we see the cedi performing well, in which it is appreciated by 25% against the US dollar alone. And it's also appreciated against the pound sterling and also the euro as well. So that tells you that in terms of the stable currency, which is very, very important for those of you who want to do business in Ghana or, even live in Ghana, day-to-day costs, having a stable currency, it makes, living more bearable. Yeah, I'm not saying it's, all glitter and gold, but it's much more, having a stable currency, as we've had this year in Ghana, has made living more bearable than what it was 2022-23 and early part of last year. However, despite the good news about the stabilization of the cedi and modest rebound of the economy, low interest rates and low inflation, prices are still high, and we'll tell you why, prices are still high. So even though, like I said, inflation is down in Ghana, the cost of goods and services in Ghana are still high. Let me tell you why, despite the macroeconomic figures and also the stabilization of the currency, why the price of goods and services and also particular food inflation is still high in Ghana. So many businesses in Ghana adjusted their prices upward during the crisis of 2023. So when the cedi was about 15 to $1, when interest rates were 35%, when inflation was 54%, many businesses adjusted the prices upwards. So during this high inflation period, importers priced goods using worst case exchange rate assumptions. Shops increased prices to protect their margins of business. Transport, utilities, and logistics costs all rose, yeah? Now, that's since come down, particularly with the fuel on the world market has gone down to something in the region about 60, 68, $70, yeah? But like I said, a lot of businesses did not price for now. They priced for when the cedi was at 15 to $1, yeah? So because inflation is falling, businesses are not rushing to reduce their prices. Why? Because they want to cover losses from the previous years. They also expect future instability in case if cedi goes back up again, or rather appreciates against the dollar. So it's appreciated rather, sorry, against the dollar, but businesses may worry if it depreciates again. Yeah. And Ghana's market is not that competitive. So prices are sticky. So it doesn't allow for particularly the smaller boys. I mean, the big boys who have got bigger, you know, more deeper pockets and can you know carry some of the costs to themselves. They are able to reduce prices, but not that much. But most businesses in Ghana, because the market is not highly competitive, they have to keep the prices relatively high. So another reason why the cost of goods and services are still high in Ghana, despite the macroeconomic figures, is because even though the cedi has stabilized, import costs remain high. Yeah. So many goods that were imported are older, like I said, older exchange rates, yeah. And also global shipping costs remain high. So during the pandemic, yeah, that made shipping costs very, very high. Yeah. And also these costs were put on to businesses and they put that onto the customers. Yeah. So global shipping costs are still high, haven't gone down since COVID. Again, import duties in Ghana, this is a big one, why the cost of goods and services in Ghana are high. Import duties at the port charges are still very, very high. Yeah. And because Ghana imports everything from fuel to food to spare parts to medicine to electronics, yeah, because of this, their cost structure remains expensive. Yeah. So this is why it compounds the need for businesses to put in their prices, so they can offset some of those costs that they incur, i.e., the port and the duties, with higher costs, with higher prices. And again, interest rates are still high in Ghanaian, in African terms, which is affecting businesses' ability to affect their costs. So even though the policy rate is now 18%, commercial lending rates in Ghana are still high. So banks' lending rates often exceed 30%. Yeah, and there's been, a cry from the AGI, which is the Association of Ghanaian Industries, for the banks, commercial banks in Ghana, to lower interest rates, because if it does, that will help businesses, access to finance. And if you live in Ghana, one thing about Ghana you must know, that access to finance is a big deal, is a huge problem for many SMEs in Ghana. Yeah. So when businesses borrow at higher rates, they naturally pass the cost to the consumers. Hence, why the cost of goods and services is high. And lastly, the taxes, levies, and fees are rising. So Ghana's fiscal situation is tight. So government relies heavily on VAT, levies on fuel, import duties, and fees and charges at the ports. So these taxes directly increase prices. Yeah. So these nuisance taxes, which were, annulled at the early of the year, the e-levy taxes, the emissions taxes, the betting taxes, and other taxes, which were troublesome nuisance taxes earlier in the year, have been removed by the government in their budget recently. However, you won't see the full effect until January next year. So hopefully, throughout next year, when these taxes kick in, these lower taxes start kicking in, hopefully the cost of goods and services in Ghana will begin to go down. Okay, so because of all these things I've just said, yeah, and added to that, there's structural issues within the Ghanaian economy, which makes prices high. Yeah. So, for example, low production. Like I said, Ghana imports key commodities like rice, sugar, oil, poultry, spare parts, pharmaceuticals, etc. Right? These things equal price vulnerability. There's also weak supply chains in Ghana, poor storage, transportation inefficiencies, and also middlemen, at the ports and layers of cost. And also energy costs in Ghana are quite high. So electricity costs and also fuel costs are high, yeah. And also, like I mentioned, the electricity company of Ghana has got huge debt. And unfortunately, how they're going to recoup that debt, yeah, is by, you know, uh, increasing the cost of electricity utilities. So again, now the burden of businesses and also they pass on this cost to consumers. And so, despite the positive outlook in 2025 and for 2026, yeah, prices are high in Ghana. And this has compelled the cost of living crisis in Ghana. So during, COVID and the back end of COVID, right, that saw inflation peak at 54%. That precipitated a rapid cost of living crisis in Ghana. Added to this is that Ghanaian wages have not really risen in line with the inflation. Yeah. So many older Ghanaians are not seeing an increase in their salaries. However, rent, food, transport, and utilities have tripled since COVID. Businesses are more cautious, and this has compelled a cost of living crisis in Ghana that has not gone down. It is still there. Yeah. And so we hope that next year, when these taxes start to kick in terms of, the removal of the e-levy tax, the removal of the COVID levy tax, the removal of the emission taxes, we hope that will have some effect on the economy, but more particularly the cost of living crisis that Ghanaians are facing right now. Food is not expensive in Ghana. Food inflation is higher than normal inflation. So, like I said, normal inflation in Ghana is 6% as of December. But food inflation in Ghana is triple that. Yeah, 18%. And it's mostly because Ghana imports too much food. Rice, cooking oils, cassava, yams that we should be growing ourselves. And I'll talk about that in this week in agriculture. Tomatoes. Ghana virtually imports everything it needs to eat. So this is why, added to the fuel costs, food inflation is high in Ghana. And so, the cost of living remains an issue for many Ghanaians, despite, certain improvements in the economy. But on that, many Ghanaians are saying that if we can't fit in our pockets, yeah, then for them, the economy hasn't really improved. So I understand where they're coming from because, yes, macro level, the economy is beginning to rebound from the mess that Mahama and NDC inherited. It's beginning to come down. However, that change is not yet reflected in the pockets of the ordinary Ghanaian. Yeah. And so the change that they voted for in massive numbers last year have not yet materialized as far as many Ghanaians are concerned. And, the cost of living is still high in Ghana. But hopefully, like I say, from next year onwards, when these other taxes start to kick in, the removal of the taxes kick in, it's hopefully, and the import duties as well, hopefully, things will get better for the ordinary Ghanaian, throughout 2026. And so that's the economy and the cost of living done. We look at unemployment now. Unemployment is a massive issue in Ghana, and some commentators have stated that this is a ticking time bomb. And we already see some of the consequences of this high unemployment. Unemployment right now in Ghana, yeah, is 30% across the board. And for youth under 30, yeah, and Ghana is a very young population. I think the average age in Ghana is about 20, yeah. But youth unemployment is somewhere between 40 and 50%. Yeah. So this is very disturbing for a country that wants to, industrialize and develop when you've got high youth unemployment. Yeah. And so Mahama's 24 economy has to work, yeah? And the only way it can work is not because of private foreign so-called investment, because for me, that's a red herring. This drive for so-called foreign direct investments, right, is another form of slavery, because these companies come in with the so-called capital, yeah? But they pay meager wages, yeah? And also the profits that they make goes out of Ghana, called capital flight. So if Mahama wants to and then you see if they want to reduce the massive youth unemployment here, and also if they want to ensure that Ghana's economy remains on track, then they've got to really, for me, what they've got to do is to reopen some of those factories that got shut by, Rawlings, those incumbent industries that were shut down primarily by Rawlings and Kufuor. So, for example, Ghana imports too much sugar. What you can do, Mahama, NDC, reopen Commander Sugar Factory in the Commander area of Ghana in the Central region. Right, and you can use the money, and this is, and again, coming on to parts of the economy, we don't get much for gold. Even though Ghana right now gold is at record prices, it peaked at $4,500 an ounce. I think middle of the year, it's now back down to $3,700 an ounce, which is still higher than the average of about 3,200 for most of last year, 2024. So right now, Ghana gets just 4% royalty from gold. That's not enough for development and industrialization, which is why Ghana always has to go to the international markets to borrow money. Now, for me, if Ghana got at least 30% royalty rate from gold, yeah, and Ghana mines more than 5 million ounces of gold every year, you times that by average of about $3,500 an ounce. You do the math. When you see how much money Ghana can make if Ghana increased the royalty rate from 4% to 30%. And some of that money that we get from the royalty rate can be used to open Commander Sugar Factory so that we grow our own sugar rather than import it. Another factory that could be opened is the tire factory at Bonsa in the Western region. For those of you who are not aware, under Nkrumah, Ghana had a tire factory in the Western region. Yeah, because the Western region, particularly a place called Bonsa, is endowed with rural plantation. So Nkrumah knew this. This is why he purposely, strategically built the tire factory at Bonsa in the Western region. So rather than importing tires, giving other people a job, we can create our own employment, our own jobs by cultivating rural plantation in the Bonsa area of the Western region, cultivate that rubber into tires. Again, creating more employment for our youth. And those tires could be bought by Ghanaians themselves. Also, some of those tires could be exported to other West African countries, because the tires that we make in Ghana will be for the West African condition, the heat, the intense heat, and also the rainy season. Rather than importing tires from Europe, that is for European climate. Yeah? And you wonder why our tires in Ghana don't last long. Because we're importing tires that are for European condition, not a Ghanaian or African condition. So that's two ways, like I said. If Mahama is serious about 24-hour economy and serious about wanting to curtail this youth unemployment time bomb, these are two examples I've given him that he can do. Reopen strategically some of Kwame Nkrumah's old industries that were shut down by Rawlings and by Kufuor, reopen them with money from more royalty rates, and that could be used to industrialize Ghana and reduce this massive unemployment problem that we see in Ghana. Every year in Ghana, more than 250,000 people leave our universities, technical college, and college of higher education, and there's no job for them. Mahama NDC, you got the plan. Income for you a template, 7-year development plan. Take out the best from it and then tweak it and manipulate it for 2026 and improve it. Yeah, because if you don't, yeah, this unemployment ticking time bomb can have major consequences, and we see it already, particularly with increased 419, in internet crime. Just recently, a Ghanaian was extradited from, sorry, a Ghanaian has extradited from to America because he duped many white American women into love relationships that did not, materialize, and he conned many white American women of $8 million. Yeah, and has now been caught, sent back to America for trial because of this, and that's then because of no jobs in Ghana. Also, prostitution among our women is high, particularly in Accra. Everywhere in Accra, Caprice, Osu, Laboni, East Legon, the poor areas of Accra, rich areas of Accra, young girls are prostituting themselves. Why? Because there's no job, or there's not a job that pays well. Yeah, because many Ghanaians, like I said before, Ghanaians haven't seen an increase in their pay for years. Just the other day, some Ghanaian working in the public sector got a 90% pay rise. Yeah, 90%. Yeah. When you look at the cost of living in Ghana, which has doubled, yeah, and like I said, prices remain high, that's hardly enough, particularly for a man who's got a family to look after. So this is why many young girls, yeah, who are unemployed are doing this prostitution, because there's no jobs out there. So this is the consequences of this youth unemployment, and also the rise in crime. Armed robbery in Ghana is becoming now an everyday occurrence. Yeah. And if you come to Ghana, you need to be aware of armed robbery, because there's armed robbery happening in Ghana on a daily basis. And you, as a diasporan, yeah, you be a big target. Yeah. So youth unemployment cannot be emphasized enough. The government must take 2026 as a year to tackle youth unemployment, because if it doesn't, as you've seen already, the consequences could derail, any economic, macroeconomic figures the government may want to tout with. And the last issue for now is housing. So, as I mentioned in my budget analysis, one of the biggest omission from the budget was any salient housing policy, excuse me, to build affordable houses for Ghanaians. Right now, as I mentioned, there's a housing crisis in Ghana. All the housing being built in Ghana is not catered for 95% of Ghanaians. So all these luxury apartments you see in Laboni, East Legon, cantonments, airport residential area are luxury end, high end. And they're tailor-made for so-called expatriates, diasporas from the African diaspora, and also investors who may see these high-end units as an investment opportunity. However, the reality is, because these apartments are very, very expensive, particularly to rent, many of these new apartments are empty. You go to airport residential area, East Legon, cantonments, Laboni, Airport Hills, these plush areas, Ridge, many of these trendy luxury apartments are empty. Why? Because no one can afford to live in them. But we know people are using drug money and also money that they've attained in a very, very devious way to wash it away in the real estate industry. So, for me, this housing crisis is serious, because Accra is getting too overpopulated, and there's not a proper structure in place. Yeah, in terms of planning, people are just building haphazardly, and that's causing a lot of congestion within the outer skirts of Accra. And so the government should have implemented a policy whereby it will use money again from the revenue from gold, diamonds, and the new one on the block, lithium. Lithium prices are low right now, but going forward, because of its using electric cars, and what have you, lithium is a sought after commodity. And the price will go back up. And so we've got to extrapolate, value for money from our resources, yeah, so that we can use that money to build housing projects, just like Nkrumah built Tema, just like Achampong built at the time, West Africa's largest estate, down some mine, the same way that Mahama and then NDC can use the next 3 years to use revenue from gold, from oil, from lithium, from diamonds to build sustainable, affordable housing for many Ghanaians. Because right now, many Ghanaians are struggling even to pay rent, and rents have doubled in Accra alone in the last 2 years since COVID. Doubled. In some cases, tripled. Yeah, and because the rent laws in Ghana did not work, landlords are charging sometimes up to 3 years advance, and that's hampering many Ghanaians. So, housing is a massive problem in Ghana. Housing is at a crisis level in Ghana, and there's a housing shortage in Ghana, particularly where the massive Ghanaians are concerned. And so, we hope that next year and the next few years to come, government initiates and implements a affordable housing policy scheme whereby the ordinary Ghanaian can afford to buy a house and later, rent house and then later buy a house as some kind of, buy to rent scheme or rent to buy scheme, just like Margaret Thatcher did in the UK in the 80s. Yep, because housing is a very, very important commodity for industrial development and industrial growth. If people haven't got housing, it does, present social issues for the country. So it is very, very important that the government, in 2026 and beyond, has a sustainable, eco-friendly, affordable housing policy. I didn't mention the opposition. I don't think we've got time to mention the opposition, so we'll leave it here for now. This has been a review of Ghana 25, looking at the economy, the cost of living, unemployment, and housing. Yeah, in part 2, we're going to look at Ghana illegal small-scale mining. We'll be looking about health, agriculture, and also the opposition New Patriot Party, what they've done in 2025 and what they hope to do in the year to come. So this has been Ghana Focus Special, Year in Review 2025 Part 1. If you like what you hear, please share to your friends, family, social media networks. Subscribe to Ghana African Focus on YouTube. Subscribe to Ghana African Focus on Spotify. And don't forget to hit the notification button, meaning that every time we upload a new podcast, Spotify or YouTube will notify you of that. All right, okay. So for myself, Kwame, and from all the crew here on Ghana in Focus, is thank you very much for listening. And we'll see you next week for part 2 of Year Review 2025.